You want to know about the word pike, and I always wondered about it. So I'm going to read you the definition of the pike, of piking, and this is the process of piking. So it's a verb and it's a noun as well. So this is someone who is explaining how he pikes this road. I cut a ditch entirely across the road, 3 feet deep. About 20 yards below it, I cut a similar ditch. I blended them with fence rails and I filled them nearly full with small stones. Then I graded a curved valley over them about 10 feet wide, 18 inches deep, and I piked them with flint stones, broken small, 8 or 10 inches thick. I scraped the mud and dirt from the side ditches into the middle of the road. I filled it up high, and now it's solid and dry. I made and I piked a viaduct to carry the water across the road and into a ditch cut into the adjacent field. The entire bottom is now a beautiful, solid, smooth road. The Rockville Pike, it's the road we all love to hate. And it's in our lives. It's people who have traveled through here, people who live here, people who work here. It's very much the spine of Rockville. It's the main road. But it was a major thoroughfare long before Rockville was Rockville. It was always a major route between important places. So the important places changed, but always the way to get there did not. And if you look at old records, or if you have people referring to this road, they're talking about the main road, the Rock Creek Road, the Great Road. It's one of the major roads in here, and you can document it for about 300 years. It's really very interesting to do that. So Peerless Rockville has been able to find evidence of this past of Rockville all along the Pike, and you can still see evidence of that today. So it's the way to approach it. The road that we know as the Rockville Pike was well known to Indians who were traveling through here as early as the 1500s, and they were mostly going from upstate New York to western North Carolina, and this was on the route. It's an interior route. Many of the Indians took the river route, but this is the interior, and it's along a ridge road. So if you look at topography, it's right along that ridge. And when European settlers started coming into the area by the 1690s or so, the path was already there. They started using the same paths. And that's the way that they came from the Tidewater into the frontier. We were the frontier. They brought their slaves with them. They brought their families with them. They intended to settle here. So by the 1690s, you do have people living in this area. The roads the important places that they're trying to go between by that time are the major cities, the port cities like Georgetown and Bladensburg. But for the Rockville Pike, they're coming from Georgetown and they're fanning up north and west into the frontier, as are all the colonies doing at that point. And where they're heading to the west, the first really big town that they hit is Fredericktown, 2 different words. And then beyond that, they're going to what we now know as Western Maryland and on into the frontier. But the major crop of people who lived in what became Upper Montgomery County is tobacco. So people needed a way to get their tobacco down to the ports out to market. So we first know this as a colonial road, and one of the early evidences of it is General Braddock during the French and Indian War, when in 1755 he is marching up to what became Pittsburgh and what became the Battle of Fort Duquesne, where he lost his life. But there was a note in the diary saying, we stopped at Owen's Ordinary, and that Ordinary is a name for an inn. So it tells us that by the 1750s, in the area that we now know as the center of Rockville, people were stopping because they were on this great road, and they needed to stop. They couldn't do it all in one day, not vaguely do it all in one day. So the various names of our town took the names of these places where people were used to stopping. So Owen's Ordinary is what Braddock called it. Hungerford's Tavern is what people called it in the 1760s, because Charles Hungerford had a tavern here. It was called Williamsburg after Williams Brothers subdivided land in the 1780s, and Williamsburg with an H on the end. And it had a number of different names. When Montgomery County was formed in 1776, we became the county seat. Didn't choose Georgetown because that was too far away for people who lived way up in the upper county to reach. They were looking for something on an established road, like the Great Road, looking for something central, and Rockville became the county seat. It wasn't called Rockville at that point. You'll see on the older maps, it's called Montgomery CH for Montgomery Courthouse, the main function of this town. So people are buying lots in Williamsburg. They are building here. We have a town maybe or a village, I guess I should say, of maybe 200 people by the early 1800s. And people also are beginning to be a little unhappy about where their lot lines, but they want to make sure they know where their lot lines are going to be and what land they actually own. So a new plat comes out in 1803, which is hanging at City Hall in the mayor's office, and it's entitled Rockville. It's a plat of Rockville. It's the first time the name Rockville appears. So now we start to become known as Rockville. And that's the point at which people are looking to, there are more people who live in the area. Montgomery County is not quite so much way out in the frontier. People are not growing tobacco quite so much because it's really denuding the land. It's using up all the nutrients in the land, so they're trying to have other types of crops, and they're looking for better modes of transportation. So a bunch of men get together and they form a company called the Washington Turnpike Company. And this is in 1805. They get a charter from the Maryland General Assembly. They each put in $1, which is more money then than it is now. And they use that money to improve the road. They have along the way, they put turnstiles, they put gates. People who are going to use their now private road are going to pay to do that. So if you have, if you are moving your cattle from Georgetown out to your farm, if you're moving your tobacco or dairy products from out in Montgomery County and down to Georgetown to the big city, you're going to use this road, and you're going to pay to use this road because it's a good road to use. So there are lists that show how that it costs you 25 cents to move 10 head of cattle through this gate, or you're taking the stage up from Georgetown up to Sandy Spring, let's say. It's going to cost you a certain amount as you go through each of those turnstiles. So the pike is beginning to pay for itself, or beginning to be an improvement. The charter is renewed in 1818 with a slightly different way of doing it, but it's still an entrepreneurial thing. It's a business doing that. And all along the pike, there are markers that tell you you're headed from Georgetown to Rockville. It'll say 2 miles to Rockville, 5 miles to Rockville, 1 mile to Rockville. On that same marker on the way back down, it'll say X number of miles to Georgetown, so you know where you are. You've seen those kind of markers elsewhere. I've never seen one. I can sort of imagine it from going out on the road to Cumberland, for example. The last time someone remembers seeing one of those markers in Rockville, before the pike was widened so many different times, was in the 1950s, but we can imagine that they had them. So they have the toll gates, they have the markers. And you're going along this road, and this is hard to imagine now, but what you're seeing mostly are plots of woods, because the land hasn't been farmed yet, or you're seeing open fields because it has been turned into farms. And by the early 1800s, that's what you have all along the Rockville Pike. I have long lanes leading into large farms, and we're talking about farms like the Dawson Farm, which is close to where Richard Montgomery High School is now and became Hungerford. That farm has been there on the Pike since the 1840s. There's another farm farther down on that same side of the Pike, which is now Woodmont Country Club, and you can It's private property, but if you were to go in there, you would see the farmhouse that was built in the 1850s, and you'd see some of the barns and so on that were there. And so you have to imagine that on both sides of the pike. Along the way, there are communities that are coming up, because this is an easy way to travel. It's a nice place to stop and buy something along the road, stay overnight, water your horse, whatever it's going to be. So along the road you have communities, and some of the names are still around. Halpine Post Office, Montrose Post Office, Rockville once you get into town as well. And also along these roads, people are building in their communities. They're building institutions and schoolhouses, not only the stores, but schoolhouses, churches, and so on. St. Mary's Church, for example, is right at the head of the pike, just before you go into the town of Rockville and make that curve to go into the courthouse square area. St. Mary's has been there since 1817. It's the oldest continuously used church, religious building that we have in Rockville. But if you look farther down in Bethesda, for example, you have the church that Abraham Lincoln often attended. It's up on a hill when you are almost at Cedar Lane, and it's called Bethesda Church. So not only do you have the larger towns like Rockville, the largest town, but you also have these smaller towns that are going up along the way. And so the pike, by the time we have this 1865 map, you can see these communities along the way. You can see that the road is still a major thoroughfare. By the 1850s or so, the pike is, well, it's used by everyone who has to go in whatever direction they are coming. So we have evidence, and we have records and court records, for example, of fugitive slaves coming up the Rockville Pike. Hidden in plain sight is the idea of the Underground Railroad. So people could be off the pike in the woods or in the fields, or they could actually be traveling on the pike either by day or by night. It's known that we are 90 miles above us, north of us is free territory. So people are trying to go the straightest way that they can to escape either on the Underground Railroad or on their own. It's also a place where the county fair is established along the Rockville Pike, where Richard Montgomery High School is right now. That land was from the 1840s up until about 1932. That's where the county fair was located. So you used to be able to see the evidence in the track at Richard Montgomery High School, but since they rebuilt that, you can't quite see that anymore. But that's also where troops were quartered throughout the Civil War. In 1861, there were as many as 10,000 troops, Union troops, who were stationed in Rockville to make sure that Maryland stayed in the Union. So you can imagine troops, Jeb Stuart capturing a wagon train in 1863 on the Rockville Pike. The competition starts coming in for the Rockville Pike by the 1830s when the C&O Canal is built, and it's west of us, but it's also competition for getting your goods from the upper part of the state to the lower part. But the real competition occurred when the railroad came through in 1873. So if you look at a map after this 1865, when you look at the 1879 map, you can see that the railroad is paralleling the pike through much of what we know as the pike through Rockville. And what it did was to open up much faster, easier transportation for people who needed to do various things. They needed to get their farm products to the city, and by this time, by the 1870s, we're talking wheat, we're talking dairy products, we're talking corn that goes down to the big city, but we're also talking people, because developers are buying up this farmland along the pike, and they're dividing it up into small lots. They're selling lots to people who want to live out in the country but get on the train and go down to their jobs in Washington. So the Victorian houses that you see along in Rockville today, many of them on both the east and the west side of the railroad tracks were built as a result of the railroad coming through. And to make it even worse for people who are trying to keep the pike as a business, the trolley comes to Rockville, starts coming up the pike as early as 1895, and it reaches Rockville by 1900. So from 1900 to 1935, you could have seen, and you will see in these pictures, you could have seen trolleys going up and down the pike. Often as fast as 60 miles an hour, if you can imagine that. But they slowed down at waiting stations, like at Montrose Road. There was a waiting station, at Randolph Road, excuse me, there was a waiting station there, and then little businesses that are along the pike as well. The pike is getting more and more worn down. People are complaining about the pike in the 1890s and early 1900s as much as we complain about it today. They're more complaining about the condition of the pike. And the Maryland Geological Survey did a study in 1899, and they said no road in the county was more in need of improvement than the pike, because the pike had long been known as one of the worst pieces of main highway in the state. So around that time, the Washington Turnpike Company declared bankruptcy and deeded the pike to the Montgomery County Commissioners. The State Roads Commission in Maryland was created in 1908, and they were trying to plan a modern highway system. There are bicyclists who are pushing for improvements of the roads, and there are also people who are in automobiles, and they're pushing for improvements of the roads. There's a new interest in making the pike a little bit better traveled. And by 1925, the pike is paved. Paved means there's a section in the middle, and there are two sections on the side, just in case you might meet another car crossing you on the pike. And I've talked to people who grew up in Rockville who remember taking in their cars, traveling up or down the pike and not seeing another car between what we know as Strathmore Avenue today and where you turn in at St. Mary's and you start going down towards the courthouse. So you might not pass another car. You also wouldn't have to stop at any stoplights, because there weren't any stoplights on the pike for many, many years. The first stoplight in Rockville was at Washington and Courthouse Square, and that was a stop and go light. So what happens after the automobile is taking over is that everything is orienting to the automobile. We don't have any trouble figuring that out in today's world. But so there are stores along the pike. They are they're servicing cars with gas or repairs. There are bridges over the railroad tracks, so you can get your car over there. There are cabins, there are motels along the pike. There's a sanitarium that's advertised. You can come out and spend your summer here and get well for whatever ailment you have. People are starting to come from Washington because they have access to cars. They're starting to come out to the country. They used to come out to Rockville and beyond in the country via railroad, and then you could only get so far if you were staying for a weekend or you were staying for a summer. Now they can come out every weekend by taking their car. So you get estates being built up all along the pike, and you can see evidences of all of those as well. The Corby Mansion, which is now Strathmore Hall, the Wilkins Estate, which is now Park Lawn Cemetery. The buildings are all still there. And of course, the best one in Rockville is the Lyons Estate, which is now Glenview Mansion. All of those were made possible for people to improve them and to use them because of the automobile. And this is the era when F. Scott Fitzgerald was driving the pike as well. I don't think I would have wanted to be around when he was driving. He apparently was a terrible driver. This other new mode of transportation was coming in and started an airport on the Rockville Pike. Bought up land from a farm, and by 1928 there were small planes flying in and out of what was called Congressional Airport. And he named it Congressional Airport because he wanted people to, he wanted congressmen to come in and out of their districts through that. He lost to Hoover Airport, which became national, but he still had the right idea. And people like L. Ron Hubbard, Arthur Godfrey would fly in and out of the Congressional Airport in Rockville. And I've met lots of people who spent their Sundays on a little rise on the Rockville Pike, just watching across the road and watching the planes coming in and out, and that was a big thing. So after World War II, the pike really is evolving and changing in terms of both function and form. The population of Rockville is just multiplying after World War II. The trolley's no longer there. Now we have buses. The town is growing exponentially, and we need larger and wider and more roads. We're fortunate to have the slides that Dick Hosepian, mayor of Rockville, took in 1957, which shows the Rockville Pike being widened to 4 lanes. We know that's the same year that what we now know is Interstate 270 opened. So you can see the kind of service there is to and through Rockville at that point. We have research and development going along on Halpine Road and on Twin Brook Parkway right off the Pike, and that's because there are improved roads to have access and contact with other places that people want to be. Twin Brook is growing. Hungerford is growing up as well. Congressional Airport goes out of business in 1959 to make way for Congressional Plaza. And it was a big thing to have name brands like Penny's come in, and Murphy's come into Rockville and serve the population that is growing. The kind of buildings that are being built along the Pike, no longer can the residents of Rockville Pike argue that that this airport is messing up this beautiful residential neighborhood, which they did argue in the 20s. So now you have small shops that come in, and one of the first 2 are a little donut shop, which is still there as a Subway shop right now in the early 1960s. And then McDonald's comes to Rockville in the early 1960s as well. And if you know anything about the history of McDonald's, Ray Kroc only put his shops with the arches and the signs there where he knew there was going to be a lot of traffic, a lot of business for those. So the Tenley building is built. Hungerford Drive takes traffic off the Pike in the early 1950s. We go through urban renewal. The Pike is widened yet again to 6 lanes in 1974, 1975. The uses are changing from small houses and small stores, although there still are some left, to I remember the Forum being built in the 1960s, the Forum Apartments, and that looks so tall. It doesn't look so tall anymore. The plans for metros started very early on, and so that took a lot of the land away from what was servicing the Pike. So by the time you get to the 1980s, you have a very different Pike than what you've been used to seeing. It's no longer the small shops. It's a lot of strip shopping centers, and some of them are actually made up into shopping center format. There are a few larger buildings, but not by the 1980s, not quite yet. There still are some churches and still are some institutional uses along there. But you're also getting some modern office buildings, not only the Tenley building, but also places like Woodmont Place, which is the glass office building. People are beginning to do some very nice architecture along the Pike. So this road that was once a through road for farmers and for soldiers, today it's a destination. And at some point in the early 80s, Rockville Pike was described as the 2nd highest revenue generating golden mile in the United States, next to Rodeo Drive in Los Angeles. So today we still complain about the Pike. It's still the road that we love to hate, but it really works.